Okay, so today we're going to talk about euthanasia. The presenters today are going to be Callie, Lee, Malia, Eric, and Brian. And while talking about this, it's important to know a few different things about euthanasia and assisted suicide. So euthanasia is where a doctor is allowed by law to end a person's life by painless means, as long as the patient and their family agree, which we'll hear about a little bit more later. Assisted suicide is a term that has been historically used and is coming out of favor, but it's where a doctor assists a patient to commit suicide if they request it. In the United States, in 1994, Oregon became the first state to legalize physician-assisted suicide. And in 2006, the Supreme Court upheld the ruling that allowed this. Between 2006 and 2008, 2 additional states would pass laws allowing physician-assisted suicide. And then no further states would pass any laws or regulations allowing this to occur until 2013. From 2013 to current, there have been 6 more states and Washington, D.C. that have passed laws allowing this to occur. This means that in 41 states, it is still considered illegal, even though there are resolutions that are going through to potentially allow this in more states. And then we'll learn about some of the standard requirements from those regulations here shortly. And from that, I'm going to pass this on to Lee, who will talk about some of the ethical issues.
Thank you, Brian, for providing a brief introduction to euthanasia within the United States. My name is Lee, and I will now expand on this topic by explaining the ethical issues that euthanasia presents to the American people. And the main ethical issues of euthanasia reflect some of the main themes from this course. First, respect for personal autonomy is one of the most commonly referenced. Proponents argue that the right to die is a protected right that has to do with personal choice and free will. Many supporters feel that the right to die is a protected right similar to the right of free speech, marriage, and procreation. Others argue that this is not the case and that the medical community has a moral responsibility to keep patients alive as reflected by the Hippocratic Oath. Opponents contest that euthanasia is a slippery slope that has the potential to lead to murder, which will unfairly target vulnerable communities like the poor and disabled by creating incentives for insurance companies to terminate lives in order to cut costs. Next slide, please. 2 other themes that present ethical issues are beneficence and non-maleficence. Beneficence is the act of doing good through moral obligation. In other words, it would be acting through charity, mercy, and kindness. Non-maleficence is a theme most famously known from the Hippocratic Oath and means to do no harm. Now, these themes further complicate the topic of physician-assisted suicide because they are subjective and are relative based on one's own experiences, perspectives, and judgment. What might be considered harm to one individual might be considered mercy to another. In this case, the term harm becomes relative. Is it harmful to provide life-ending treatment to someone who wills it? Conversely, is it harmful to keep someone alive and to watch them endure suffering? Next slide, please. And the last theme from this course that we found relevant to this topic is justice. And justice refers to the moral obligation to act on the basis of fairness, entitlement, and equality. Now, the idea of justice in regards to euthanasia really comes back to whether or not each individual has the right to die. If indeed this is a protected right, would it be considered just to withhold life-ending treatment if a patient wishes to end theirs? What about a situation in which a patient cannot or will not be able to make the decision for themselves? Furthermore, where do we draw the line on what is allowed and what is not allowed? These are all questions that the medical community and the American people alike have debated for the past few decades as euthanasia has become more and more of a relevant topic. And now that we have covered some of the controversy of physician-assisted suicide, I will now pass it on over to Callie, who will be discussing the social and cultural factors related to this topic.
Awesome. Thank you, Lee. My name is Callie. I'll be doing the social and cultural factors that lead to increased acceptance of euthanasia. So as far as the social factors, we'll touch on weaker religious beliefs, higher education, supportive legislation, a younger cohort, non-manual occupations such as white-collar jobs, economic situation, and political orientation. According to Cohen et al., the factors that displayed the highest correlation with acceptance of euthanasia were weaker religious beliefs that was then followed by achievement of higher education. Those with strong religious beliefs see euthanasia as morally wrong in the eyes of God due to a perversion of the commandment, "You shall not kill." Achievement of higher education was associated with increased autonomy and tendency towards self-determination. In countries such as Belgium, where legislation has been passed in support of euthanasia, it's been found that there's a higher acceptance of assisted dying between patient and physician and a higher frequency rate at which they are performed. As far as cultural factors, the main were national traditions, cultural values and customs, and moral beliefs. For example, according to Nortje, South African cultures are more opposed to euthanasia versus European cultures due to the belief that once the soul dies, it goes on to live with its ancestors. However, if one commits suicide, their soul becomes an evil spirit. In various studies, the common thread in a decreased acceptance of euthanasia was stronger moral values. Next slide, please. According to the 2008 EVS data, acceptance of euthanasia was associated with a geographic clustering. This suggests that national values and customs play a large role. Countries with a particularly high average acceptance include Denmark, Belgium, France, the Netherlands, Sweden, Luxembourg, Spain, Finland, Iceland, and Great Britain. However, the least accepting countries include Montenegro, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Albania, Malta, Moldova, Armenia, Georgia, Turkey, Cyprus, and Kosovo. When you look at the map here, those outlined in red are those with the highest acceptance rate, and you can kind of see a geographic clustering. And now I'll hand it over to Malia.
Thank you, Callie. I'll be talking about the social and cultural challenges in the U.S. and across the country, and across the world. In the U.S., we see a growing acceptance of euthanasia, as 2017 Gallup poll found that 73% were in favor. However, despite the slow rise of acceptance, there are many sociocultural factors that come into play with the debate on euthanasia and its implementation. In the U.S., many participants surveyed believed in personal autonomy. However, others also voiced the aspect of social morality on euthanasia that it may possibly weaken society's respect for sanctity of life. In certain states of the U.S., euthanasia is legal, and on June 8, 2016, it became legal in California. It is known as the End of Life Option Act. Despite its legal implementation, issues such as ambiguity and patient competence come into play. One of the most prominent examples of this is echoed in Netherlands, where the first ever murder case against a physician accused of violating the country's euthanasia laws due to acting on ambiguity-worded advance directive. Next slide, please. In Holland, after euthanasia legalization in 2009, UK Daily reported that euthanasia has led to a severe decline in the quality of care for terminally ill patients. This also brought up the issues of resource allocation in the argument to channel resources of highly skilled staff, equipment, hospital beds, and medication towards life-saving treatment. In addition, Colombia has also joined in the legalization of euthanasia. However, concerns about the paradox of more responsibility towards the others and the protection of the most vulnerable come into play. Arguments against euthanasia in Colombia argue that palliative care can make euthanasia unnecessary, as others argue the limitation on resources to do so. Another argument includes guilt, in which patients may feel they are burdened on resources and are psychologically pressured into consenting. Finally, one of the main concerns of its legalization in Colombia is a slippery slope to societies looking to weed out people deemed undesirable. And now I'll pass it over to Eric, who will go over legal aspects.
Thank you, Malia. So as touched upon earlier, there are 9 states in the US that have physician-assisted suicide laws. In 7 of these states, the laws were actually passed, but in 2 of the states, it's interesting to note that physician-assisted suicide was mandated by the court, which ruled that patients had this right and had the right to die. It's interesting that all states use very similar language in their laws and all have very similar requirements in order to protect both the patient and the providers. All patients must have terminal illness with less than 6 months to live. They must have a sound mind, and they must be seen by 2 different physicians that agree upon those 2 previous aspects. They must then submit an oral and written request 15 days apart. There must be 2 witnesses to the signed written request, and there are different laws pertaining to the qualifications of those witnesses. Lastly, patients must have residency in that state. Next slide. And physicians are protected by the law when prescribing end-of-life medication if they follow the rules granted by the law. Physicians also can opt out if they are morally opposed to the law. All states have standardized government consent paperwork such that patients receive similar and consistent consenting process. There are regulatory agencies that oversee the physicians and pharmacies participating, and all states have strict reporting to monitor the patients and providers that are using this medication. Lastly, there are criminal penalties for coercing a person to request the medication and for forging such documents. Next slide. Thank you for your time and for listening to our presentation on physician-assisted suicide in the United States. Here are some of our references.